We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
G'day and welcome back, Space Junkies, where today we are crossing to Canada and speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Howell. Elizabeth, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I am fantastic. It is very early in the morning here in Australia and it's not yet light, which is a novelty really. And then where you are, I guess it's afternoon. So how's that going?
Yes, it is. It's just towards the end of my workday. So we just made this work. It was barely workable on both of our sides. So you're a little tired because you barely woke up, and I'm a little tired because I've been working all day. But as long as we're coherent, I guess, for the next half hour or so, it'll be entertaining, or at least I hope it'll be.
That's right. More or less coherent. I think
Yeah.
the listeners of the Space Junk podcast are very forgiving people, and they've put up with a lot from me. I once recorded an entire podcast on an airfield in a tent during an air show, and and you're making a face that it was bad. The audio was so bad that it was almost unlistenable, but they've forgiven me for that. They can forgive me for being a little sleepy at 6:30 in the morning. What can you do? The things we do for space, the things we do for the story.
We do for space, the adventures we have, we get up pre-dawn, we get in uncomfortable buses, that's normally, of course. We go places and we have fun despite it all. So
We do, we definitely do. And I think before we go any further, it's probably the right thing to do to ask you to introduce yourself.
yes, no problem. So I'm Elizabeth Howell, and I do a lot of things, but for the purpose of this podcast, I really am into space. I saw the movie Apollo 13 when I was 13 years old, and I wanted to be an astronaut. And what ended up happening along the way was I discovered that I had maybe the talent or maybe the aptitude or maybe just the interest in writing. And so I had this great idea. It was a 2007 great idea. I'm going to graduate and I'm going to be a famous science journalist for a newspaper. And then 2008 happened. So you adapt. And the way that I adapted actually was I worked for a bunch of different places that had different mandates. So one of them was like a business journal, another one was local TV news. And it's actually really good when you're first starting your career to do lots of different things, because you learn from a bunch of different people and you pick up all these skills. And that ended up with me doing the thing I never expected I would do, which was to go into business by myself, because I had all of this different background and experiences and contacts. And so in 2012, I ended up as a full-time space journalist working for online media, definitely not what I imagined when I saw Apollo 13 as a kid. And as we'll talk about, I've had some adventures. It's been a lot of fun. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
That is a very good place to start, because I think, I myself am staring down the barrel of the end of a PhD and thinking about the world I'm about to jump back into, which is a very different world to the one it was when I first started this PhD. And you must have felt much the same thing coming out of a PhD in 2007, just before the crash.
I definitely did. So the way that my career evolved was I left in 2007 with a bachelor degree right before the crash. It was in journalism, and I thought that I had things all together. But then I learned that the world actually needs a little bit more skills than just learning how to write. You need like life experience as well, because otherwise, if you don't have a message to share, then people don't want to listen, no matter how good of a writer you are. You need to have some life maturity in there. So I began to get frustrated with these various jobs that I was doing because I couldn't keep anything for more than 6 months at a time. And so what I thought was, let's think about something that would actually move me forward instead of just spinning in the same spot over and over and over again. Let's do something different. And so while I was still working, I went to grad school virtually. Like, this was before even Zoom became online and really popular, especially these days. But I was doing conversations on online learning and platforms and chats and just sort of connecting with people at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, which isn't too far from the famous Fargo, for those who might try to situate themselves. And so there I took 2 degrees, a master's degree and a PhD in space studies. And it was really good because it pushed me out of my comfort zone. I knew that they had students that were multidisciplinary and that were sort of more comfortable on one side than another. So they were so good in terms of coaching me and helping me along the way. And by the end of that process, which took almost 10 years, I found that my writing had matured. So it was a really good process. It also allowed me to write books, because during those times when you're writing books and you feel so frustrated and you're like, I can't get another 100 words out of me, you just remember that you're writing it for somebody else, for someone who's trying to learn, the next generation, as I like to call them.
Right. The next generation. I was trawling your website, as I am wont to do, and I saw that you said that your books are written for the next generation of readers. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is those people that were where I was maybe 15 or 20 years ago. So they're sort of leaving high school, they're entering the next phase. So it might be a job, which is totally what a lot of people do. They just graduate and move right into the workforce. Other ones do what we call in Canada and the US a community college. And so it's a 1 year or a 2 degree, and then they go right into the workforce. Or they might end up doing some sort of master's, PhD, MBA, what have you. So it's those people that are at a transition point and trying to figure out what kind of path is going to suit them next, depending on their interests and their income and a whole lot of other factors. And so when I was at that age and trying to think about what really interested me, the space was sort of my guiding light. I was like, whatever I end up doing, I want to be working in space in some form. I just don't quite know what it is. I thought I wanted to do space journalism. I ended up in that field, but I wasn't really sure during that recession and during all those job changes that was where I was going to end up. I just was thinking I could end up in communications somewhere and just be doing this as a passion on the side, or all sorts of other opportunities could have come up. And so it's about, if I want to give some, I guess, life advice at that time, have a plan, but also have 2 or 3 backups that you'll enjoy. Because if I got into life with this fixed, I'm going to be a science journalist at a big newspaper, I would have failed big time, in a lot of ways. Like, I would have been really disappointed, and I would have been painting myself into a corner that maybe would not have existed for very long anyway, just given the market. But if you're adaptive and you're looking around and sort of understanding what that greater situation might be, then sometimes you can come up with something still fun, but just something you didn't expect at that time.
Yeah, I think that's something really common to a lot of people working in the space sector, is that idea of having multiple backup plans. And I think it's just because space is so hard physically. The physics of it, the technical side, all of it is so difficult that you need to have kind of redundancy on redundancy and backup on backup. And it's so fascinating that, the people who are still working in the space sector, particularly in Australia, where it is a very tough market, are those sorts of people who've had lots of different experiences, but have always kept space there and keep kind of coming at it from different angles. And one of them eventually works, or a couple of them work.
And I think that's really the key, because our economy, and this is even outside of a pandemic, okay? But our economy changes so rapidly. You see a lot of technologies accruing and changing and shaping the way that the workforce is. And I don't know where this is going to bring us, this pandemic, and what's going to come out, but I think that there might be more of an acceptance about multidisciplinary type of careers, because I think that what's going to start happening more and more is people will not be doing a 9 to 5 at an office somewhere. I think that there will be more contract work and more people willing to sort of say, I'll stay home, work a bit for now, not work a bit for this time. The way that you succeed by that is by attacking the problem, the income problem, fundamentally, right? Like, that's the big problem that we're not saying it right out loud here, but you got to make money somehow. You got to make your rent somehow, or in my case, a mortgage. And to do that, you have to think about multiple ways of earning money that are still enjoyable enough. And it's hard. There are some times where you're just going, oh my goodness, like, why didn't I go and become a lawyer or something with maybe a more assured type of career? And some people are space lawyers. I've met them. They're very awesome. But then I sort of think, but that kind of environment would have killed something inside of me, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I really love waking up in the morning not really knowing what I'm doing sometimes. And that keeps me happy.
Totally. My life is one giant side hustle. I mean, I've got so many different hobbies going on, and I can't help myself. And I think that in some ways it's such a privilege to be at where I am doing a PhD, because I have the time and the ability to follow some of those little paths through. And one of them is this ridiculous podcast. But that's a really joyous thing, that I think if you're stuck in that 9 to 5, which I was before I came to do the PhD, or more like 8 till midnight, you don't get that kind of scope, and you don't have that freedom to try out lots of different things. So it's a very positive thing.
Exactly. And then, in terms of some of the adventures I took, for example, there was an opportunity where I got to spend 2 weeks in rural Utah at a place called Mars Desert Research Station. We were near a small town called Hayesville, which nobody has ever heard of. It was way, way south of Salt Lake City, out in the middle of the desert, very red. Utah, parts of it are very, very famous for the red soil. And so you just thought, looking around you with the strange structures and the red soil, you were on Mars.
Yeah.
And they would enhance that by saying to us, you can't leave this facility unless you put on a spacesuit. And so we had little bubble helmets, and we had heavy backpacks and big, almost like sweatsuit type of exercise things that we had to wear. You get hot, you get frustrated, you get really tired very quickly. It's not a true pressurized spacesuit, but it's enough to make you really appreciate how any astronaut does their work. You're just out there. And that mission really taught me so much that it would not have been possible under a 9 to 5, because clearly I couldn't do 9 to 5 work out there. The internet would break, or I wouldn't be able to meet a deadline because I'd be so far away from somebody. But being in journalism at the time, it allowed me to just say, okay, you will get some stuff by the end of the day. End of the day could be midnight, or end of the day could be 4. Just as long as you understand what I mean, that it could have a little bit of wiggle room in there, then it's going to be fine. And it changed me in a lot of ways. One thing that was the immediate change was I went and I started learning Russian, because, of course, being in a facility full of would-be astronauts, everybody spoke like 10 languages, right? And so Russian was floating around me quite a bit. And I was going, I know a Canadian's going to be flying to space again soon, and most likely, unless the commercial crew program really hurries up here, they're going to be flying from Russia. And I sure was right. That allowed me to go twice to Kazakhstan in 2018 to see a Canadian astronaut, David Saint-Jacques, go. And I could correspond with the locals. I had enough Russian at the time, after 5 years of really hard work, to go into a grocery store and to get food and to direct people and to negotiate, which is what I did at one point, for the perfect spot to get a picture. I just went up to the guard, and it's very, very intimidating, of course, because he's in fatigues and he's sort of this great big burly security guard dude. And I said, tuda, which means over there. And so he's looking at me and he's going, Kto wy, Kanadzki press, which means, who are you? Press? And I said, da, Kanadzki press, Canadian press. And he goes, da, tuda. So I could go over there. And it was enough to communicate. Like, as you can see, it was very limited, but I was able to do it spontaneously, and it allowed me to negotiate. So that was the short-term effect.
Yeah.
And the longer-term effect, too, was to show me how to work effectively in teams, because I was taught going into it that you want to not only help the other person, but try to anticipate one step further what they may need, and then just to do it without even being asked. And who knows, but that was good relationship advice, at least for me, because I ended up married not too long after that. And when I walked into that situation, I was single. So I really, really found that it helped me in terms of life experience and also in terms of career experience. So thank you, 9 to 5, for not working for me, I guess.
That is so interesting what you say about the teamwork side. And I want to come back to asking more about this 2 weeks you spent in the desert pretending to be an astronaut, because it is so fascinating to me as someone who does sociology. But the teamwork side of it is interesting. In Antarctica, there's what they call the plate rule. And when they're selecting people to take to Antarctica, for Australian stations, one of the tests, it's very simple, I don't know if they still do it, but it used to be that they'd have like a buffet of food, and they'd watch to see who handed plates to people. So if you just took your own plate and got your food, you were out. But if you took a plate and handed it to the person behind you and so on, then that was considered to be a sign that you're anticipating the needs of others and doing good teamwork. But the other side of it then was that if you were applying for a US base and you did that, you'd be out, because they have very strict controls on, well, as it's turned out to be quite pertinent, the spread of diseases. And so handing a plate to someone is just not done at the US bases, or it wasn't at the time. So you have these different ways of looking at teamwork and what's important, which I think is super interesting. But going back to Utah, because what an experience. On this podcast, we had Jordan Bim recently, who was meant to be there right now, but obviously is not. But tell me more about it. You're in like a, as I understand it, sort of a fake habitat, a small area with a bunch of other people. How was that experience?
So it may have changed since 2014, which is when I went there. I think that the facility has been slightly renovated. And for another thing, their greenhouse burned down, believe it or not, between my mission and today. And so the greenhouse that I experienced is not the greenhouse you will have today, because the old one is clearly ashes. But that said,
Mm.
I was selected as part of a University of North Dakota crew. There was another person on our crew, Paula Kroc, who is actually in Antarctica right now. Funny as you say that, because I'm thinking about what kind of commitment that must take to be there over a winter, which is what she's experiencing. So
Yeah.
anyway, she's in Antarctica right now, and at the time she was not, obviously, and she was wanting to head this all UND crew. And what ended up happening was 5 of us came in from the University of North Dakota, all distance students,
Mm.
all over the United States, and a Canadian. We never met each other before showing up at this place, which could have been a recipe for disaster, or it could have been a recipe for fun. And then thrown in almost at the last minute was this fellow from France. So complete cultural change there too, right? Because you have somebody from a different continent whose first language is French instead of English, which wasn't the same for the rest of us. And we didn't know him because we were strangers and he was a stranger. And so anyway, what I did, I don't know about what the others did, but I called everybody before we went just to get a sense about who they were. And then there was an opportunity to all meet up at a restaurant in a more habitated place in Utah before we even went. Actually, we were in Colorado. We first met up in Colorado and then drove to Utah. So what I did was I stayed in the restaurant as people from various time zones kept flying in. And I just kept ordering more food and more drinks and more food and more drinks. And then I managed to meet everybody before we actually went in the habitat, which was the best I could do. You know, usually when an astronaut's trying to go on a mission, they want to have weeks and months and years sometimes of working with a crew, but in this case, it was the best that I could do. So we drove out there, and then the habitat, to describe it, was 2 floors. It had 5 individual rooms on the top floor for bedrooms, and then there was like a 6 kind of loose room, I think, or 7 loose rooms sometimes on the roof. So you kind of go and sleep on the roof of the other one. So ideal because it was super noisy. You had radiators and other machinery that were kind of humming. Just adjacent to the bedrooms was a work area. And so we tried to keep it quiet there, obviously, during sleeping hours, but you could cook, you could do workshop stuff, a little bit of lab work as long as it wasn't messy. If it was messy, you went downstairs because that was our equipment lock. And so we had our spacesuits down there. We had a big workshop that could fix just about anything that was broken. And it was fairly roomy, those 2 floors, but with 6 people, you can understand how sometimes it was hard to get privacy. So what we would do is we would sometimes put on that spacesuit and then walk to the greenhouse, which was sort of in a separate building at the time. And then that would allow you to have a few minutes by yourself, surrounded by greenery, which you weren't getting inside of the habitat. And it was a nice place to relax. And what we did, it was just like an astronaut. It was a crew. We had a bunch of activities we had to finish every day. So we had science experiments, we had cleanup, we had cooking. I was a horrible cook, but I tried anyway. We had experiments outside. We did EVAs or spacewalks where we would put on the spacesuits and we'd be looking at rocks or doing some navigation, running communications experiments. And then during one memorable EVA, I got to do a rover, which was incredible. I got to go on this rover in the mud because all the snow was around Utah this time. It was January, melting, causing all these traction problems with our wheels. And we were being careful, going very slowly, but still it was a bit of an experience to try and navigate this. And Paula was with me, actually, the commander, and she says, Elizabeth, you're actually quite good at driving in these conditions. And all I could say was probably it was dealing with snow in Canada. Because as it turns out, dealing with it is kind of similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar to dealing with slippery snow. You just have to kind of anticipate and look ahead and sort of drive aggressively, not unsafely, but aggressively, and kind of work for the conditions underneath you. And I found that was quite helpful, just pretending I was being in a big snowstorm in Ottawa. And yeah, like I said, it was an experience, and you're also isolated. So you're disconnected from the world around you, and that does so many fun things to your brain. Like at one point you're like, it's cool, but at another point you're going, maybe, you know, my crew is the only one really knows out here, and the mission control knows nothing. So you have to sort of learn and anticipate any kind of psychological problems that might come up.
That is extremely interesting. And I want to just apologize for, I keep sort of making noises. And normally I let my guests just talk. The reason I'm doing it is because I figured out the problem with the sound is that the timing's going off with something in the recording. And so I find that if I interject with an it gets back in the right spot and everyone can hear you properly. So I wouldn't normally do this, and it's very uncomfortable for me, but it's the only way we can hear what you have to say without it getting out of whack. So in terms of that feeling of isolation and the way that it impacted you psychologically, what did you notice?
So what I noticed was that there was an in-group, out-group feeling. Now, funny enough, it wasn't so much on the crew, which I learned later doing research can happen. It's like high school, right? You know how there's the cool kids, the not so cool kids, and there's little in-groups, out-groups fighting, and it's always about this little matters. That can happen because it's a matter of being stuck in a small space with limited resources, and that's how a high school feels. I mean, it doesn't matter how big it is. It could be a high school with 2,000 people. You still feel like you're in limited resources in a small space because that's the nature of high school. And human nature, admittedly, still does not change very much, unfortunately, even as you get older. So that's one aspect of it. But what we were finding was that there was an in-group with the crew, and then we felt a little bit of an out-group with the people in mission control who were supposed to be helping us. And that is very, very common because what you think, being in the moment, is they can't possibly understand what we're going through because we're sitting here, we can see that this is broken and we're going to do it this way. But the problem is when you go outside of the procedure and you do something that mission control can't predict, they can't help you.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so important for mission control and for astronauts to be in sync all the time. So even if you're on Mars and you're far away, you need to be sending status reports of some sort back and forth and just waiting for the responses, because the more that you communicate, the less you have this problem. People just not understanding what's going on in real time. And I'll point out that in real time, in space exploration, when you see it, whenever you see a spacewalk, which is usually the time when people most tune into NASA TV, they've got two people outside. So they're both out there, they can see what's going on immediately and they can help each other, but they also have helmet cameras so that people down on the Earth can suggestions because it's all right there in front of them, it's clear. And not only that, there's a person inside the space station and their only job is to help the people on the spacewalk. So there is somebody immediately almost in the room, if you can imagine, although obviously they're in oxygen and the other people are not, they're out in space, right. But they're there on site, able to help with anything that happens. And what happened was a few years ago, the astronaut Luca Parmitano, he had water coming into his helmet. And it was a big team effort to try and get him in safely, which they did. But it was a big effort because they had to bring him back. So he had to walk himself back on the space station in darkness because that's just how these things happen, right? It's always at least convenient. There was another crewmate following him. And then they had to repressurize the airlock for him to get inside because you can't just walk in. There's a pressurization problem. It can hurt blood vessels. It can hurt your ears. It can hurt all sorts of other things. And the person inside, Karen Nyberg, who was supposed to be managing the spacewalk, she had her hand on the dial to figure out the oxygen. And she's listening to all the communications happening with her crewmates and looking at the video. And she's trying to gauge how fast to move that oxygen dial. And you can only do that type of thing in person. You don't want somebody in mission control doing that stuff. But at the same time, mission control was feeding the information they could because they had a big team of people there, including spacesuit experts. And so they were flowing all the information up they could to help them as well. And it worked. There were some problems along the way with communication, which are read the report. It's just an interesting report what happened. But anyway, the point is they worked together, they got them in safely, and then they made procedures so it wouldn't happen again, which is really what NASA's really good at.
That sounds absolutely incredible. I feel like my heart rates up just hearing the story. It sounds fantastic.
Thank you.
And I think that that's something like in your writing and so on that comes across in the things that I've read that you've written is that storytelling element and that ability to kind of take what is important about something that's going on and weave a narrative around it that brings the reader in, which I think is so cool. And I'm very excited about your new books that are coming out this year. I think it's got to be a record to have 3 books coming out in 1 year. Honestly, it seems greedy. But the ones that I was particularly excited about are the one about the search for life on Mars and the one about the Canadarm, only because the Canadarm has a very interesting legal regime attached to it. And I was guest lecturing for a space law course in January and gave the students some scenarios. And one of them involved using the Canadarm to jettison some stuff and then blaming Canada, which I thought was quite amusing. Anyway, that's by the by. But tell us about the books and what you're excited about.
What I'm really excited about is a chance to communicate in a longer medium, because most of my writing for the public is delivered in like 400 or 700 word chunks, which is fun. I love the exercise of putting a lot of information in quickly and funneling it to you. You read it in 2 minutes so you know what's most important. But over a book, you have a chance to develop a theme. And so the Mars book, my co-author, his name is Nicholas Booth, and you have to look him up because he really loves true crime type stuff. And he was doing it even before it was popular, even before it was all over NPR and Netflix and everything else. He was onto really, really cool older stories about true crime, mostly with British people, and just so exciting. So anyway, he and I were talking over the Mars thing because he used to do space and I do space now, and we realized that it's a detective story. It's a series of spacecraft going over to Mars, and with the investigators on Earth, obviously, ferreting out the clues and trying to draw conclusions from whatever evidence that you can find, right? At the beginning, the evidence was very scant. We had flybys, and we had black and white photographs, and there would be maybe 20 images a mission, which sounds like nothing now, but was huge in the 1960s. And the first few spacecraft that went by, they're taking pictures, they're sending back all 20 of them or whatever, and the spacecraft we're seeing craters. And you're going, well, there can't be life in craters. This cannot be, And so anyway, that was the conclusion. But then they had Mariner 9 arrive. And Mariner 9 arrived in 71, I believe. And it got to the planet. And they're going, what are those funny features there? We can't see anything on this planet, but we see these kind of funny features kind of sticking out. And so anyway, they're doing more analysis. It's a big dust storm. And it's covering the planet. And there were these funny little circular features kind of peeking out through the dust. And then finally, the dust began to go down. It took about 6 weeks because that's how Martian global dust storms work. And they realized it was volcanoes, huge volcanoes that were even larger in at least one case than here on Earth on Mount Everest. Then they also saw this huge canyon called Valles Marineris. It was named after the mission, obviously, Marineris. And it was bigger than the Grand Canyon. And then they began to realize that Mars had a more complex geology than ever imagined. Now, the search for life on Mars has been rather torturous because we've been sending missions, and some of them, like Viking, for example, found very ambiguous results that are still argued over today. Other ones did follow eventually, and they found that they were these rocks that were made in water, like hematite. And then the Curiosity rover, which landed in 2012, it found a stream. It was very clearly a stream. It had rounded rocks, the whole thing, just no water. The water had evaporated. And then they just kept going over towards this mountain on the planet. And on the way, they kept getting distracted because they saw more rocks and more features that were clearly formed in running water. In fact, the engineers got in trouble with the Auditor General at one point because they were going so slowly. And the engineers are going, but this is too cool, right? We're here, we're seeing all these water features, and the Auditor General's going, you're supposed to be at the mountain. That's the whole point of the mission, to go to the mountain. So there was a big debate. And anyway, they're on the mountain now, and guess what? There's still water. They keep climbing and climbing and climbing, and they still find more water up and up and up. So now what we're thinking is that from these various missions, which I have just compressed very badly and very quickly into about 3 minutes, that there was life possibilities, or what we would call habitability, I guess in a more scientific sense, on the red planet, on Mars, and that we just need to have more advanced tools to figure out what might be there. Like, for example, we've seen organic materials, but are they from life or are they from other processes that could be using organics as well? And so the more advanced rovers that will be going there soon will be, one of them will be caching the samples. That'll be the Perseverance rovers from NASA. And it will be keeping those samples aside so we can actually pick them up later and bring them back to Earth and take a better look. And then there also will be the Mars, ExoMars, Rosalind Franklin rover, which is going from Europe and Japan in 2022. And that one will be looking at organics and what types there might be and whether they are life-friendly or not life-friendly. And I'm also leaving out all the orbiting missions that are going to be going there this year and that have already been there and taking pictures. And so it's a long story and fascinating, and I hope you have a chance to read the book, because that in particular has been a very, very fun journey. And it's like 56 years. Just started interesting, like we're just starting to learn things.
Right. It sounds like The Wire, but on Mars.
Yes, exactly. It's the wire, but on Mars. That's exactly the situation. You just don't know week to week what you're going to turn up. And the problem is, too, the media tends to ignore it after a while. They're like, oh, they just found more evidence of water. They just found more evidence of water. Like
Yeah.
we get kind of blasé after a while.
Well, I guess that's the thing about telling a story in 400 or 700 words, and having deadlines and needing to keep up readership and all of those things, is you do have to keep bringing something fresh. And science isn't always super cooperative because, as you say, I mean, it's amazing. They're finding more and more evidence of this water. But that's why I thought it was more like The Wire, in that it's a longer time period. It takes a long time to get all of the pieces and bring them together. And that doesn't mean it can't be told in a way that is incredibly engrossing. And then the Canadarm.
Oh my gosh, the Canadarm book, that was the book I wanted to write when I was a kid. When I was watching Apollo 13, I had the books. They're actually in my office right now, but I'm always on the podcast. But Lydia Dotto was a well-known Canadian space journalist from the 1980s and the 1990s, and she was there right at the beginning of all of our Canadian space missions. So she got to talk to the astronauts, and she did a great job. She's still living now, actually, and I wrote her, and she wished me well and everything with my project, and which is just amazing for me because these were pioneers. And these were people that were sort of talked about a lot during their missions, but then in between, which sometimes lasted years, sometimes decades almost, they would go and they would do other work in NASA and contribute in other ways. And they were not sometimes recognized for that in-between time. It was only the space time that they were sort of seen to be interesting. And then all the stuff in between, they were not. And so, for example, Julie Payette, who was the second Canadian female in space, she actually she went away for a while and she worked on simulation aspects. And so did Marc Garneau, who was the first astronaut in space. He did software that was used on the International Space Station. We had other people that took management positions. Chris Hadfield, for example, a name that you probably know now, he actually went and he was working really hard in the Russian space program for a bit, so he got some really good experience there. And this was stuff, as I said, that was undercovered. So when it came time, I eventually had gone through this maturing process where I was going through the MSc and the PhD, and I was sort of learning and figuring out how to write. And a longtime advisor of mine said, Elizabeth, now's your time to write a book. And even though it's my third book coming out, it's the first one I got a contract for. And the reason I got a contract for it was my mentor, who introduced me to Jack, my editor for the Canadarm book, as it turned out. Jack was very skeptical that I could write this book because I was trying to write a history book and I was trying to put a little bit of maturity, as I said, in it. And at the time, I was probably about mid-30s. And he's going, who's this kid? Like how would she know? And I'm serious, because you don't know, right? It could be somebody that just has no life experience and just would sort of put, blather in a book, and it wouldn't really make any sense. And so what I did was I ran out and I got a bunch of recommendations. Chris Hadfield was very, very kind and gave me a recommendation. When I showed that recommendation to Jack, that sold the book right there. So thank you, Chris. You're an awesome person in so many ways, and that really helped. And then what I did was I sat down with all of the astronauts that I could find. Now, one or two of them bowed out for scheduling or other reasons, but I managed to get just about every Canadian astronaut that's ever flown. And even if I didn't interview them, I mentioned them very promptly in my book and very warmly. And I learned so much, because it's not only about what they did in space, but also what they did on the ground and what they did afterwards, because many of them remain committed to public service, even though they're in their 70s. But if I'm sort of giving one message out of the book, that's why the Canadian astronaut program has succeeded. We've always been about community service, helping others, again, about passing the plate, like you were saying earlier, even though it might have germs on it. We just want to help, and that's how come our little program, our little tiny program, and our Canadarm has been able to succeed. We are figuratively and literally, with that Canadarm and the Dexter, giving helping hands to everybody else. And so that's Canadarm collaboration that published in October. And so far, so good. We haven't heard any changes to the publishing schedule. And I mean, who knows? Maybe I can have a tiny little party, 5 people, I don't know. Or I'll do a Zoom party when the time comes. So I'll keep you posted.
That sounds like a great idea. And I think that spirit of collaboration and assisting people is something that Australia, is a country with a lot of similarities to Canada, and its own small space program can really, I think, take from Canada and learn from as we're developing that as well. Elizabeth, it has been so lovely speaking to you. I'm aware that you need to go and eat your dinner, so I think we better finish up. But was there anything you wanted to leave our watchers or listeners with?
You should go and find me on Twitter. So my account is called Howell Space, so HOWELL Space, and I talk about all the space news that's happening, as well as myself, my own news. So this week, I don't know how soon as you're publishing this, but I'm keeping an eye on the new astronaut launch that's going to be happening in a couple of days from American soil. I was lucky enough to go see the space shuttle launches when they were happening a decade ago, which feels like it feels like a long, long time ago, given all the changes in space since that time. And now they're finally starting to launch stuff from American soil. So when that starts to happen, watch the space race accelerate again. Watch a bunch of different types of spacecraft and different types of nations get the opportunity to collaborate. And this next decade is going to be awesome. So Australia, bring some more people into space. I'll try and get our Canadians up there as well. And who knows, maybe you and I can meet with a handshake up in space someday, you and I.
That would be phenomenal, as long as we've both used a lot of hand sanitizer first.
Exactly. Lots of hand sanitizer.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you.